This is going to be a review of cell theory, the cell organelles, and levels of organization so that you can retake your science test. And I will give you more information later about that. So let's start off by reviewing the scientist. One guy that was not a scientist was Leeuwenhoek, and he was actually a fabric trader. He would go buy fabric from different places, but he had a friend, Robert Hooke, who was actually a scientist. And he probably was a bit poor. He was probably not a very wealthy man, and so he decided instead of buying one of the expensive new microscopes, he could make one. His did not look anything like Robert Hooke's. I would say it looked more like a little magnifying lens than a microscope. But he was able to see over 200 microorganisms and drew sketches of them that we have today. As a matter of fact, you can see some of his sketches if you go online and look up like Leeuwenhoek, flea. He did lots of sketches, and the flea sketch is just magnificent. And so his detail was so good. But people would not respect him because he was not a scientist. But so he sent some of his drawings to his friend Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke took a look at it and thought he might be onto something. So he started looking at things, and lo and behold, with his better microscope, he was able to look at cork and see these little boxes, little containers inside everything that he looked at. And he said, wow, that looks like the little rooms in a monastery. Like they look like little cells, and he was the first person to ever call it the cell. And so eventually we took the first part of the cell theory, which says the cell is the basic unit of life, and that came from Robert Hooke's discovery there. So the next two guys, they were German scientists that were professors at universities. One of them was a botanist who studied plants, and he started looking at parts of plants like the leaf, and he started noticing there was these little containers like in the plant's leaves. And so he was like, I think that this is those things that Robert Hooke said were cells. So he said, I think all plants are made of cells. Schwann, his friend, said that he was a biologist and studied animals, and so he started looking at parts of animals, and he started seeing these little containers in the muscle and in the skin and everything, and he started realizing that all animals were made of cells. So when we take their two ideas, that all plants and all animals are made of cells, then I can come down to this part of it where it says all organelles are composed of one or more cells. And I remember Schwann because it rhymes with swan, which is an animal. So Schwann studied the animals. Schleiden did the plants. Well, probably 100 years later, Rudolf Virchow was studying tuberculosis and diseases. He was a pathologist who did a lot of work in the hospitals and studying about how people spread diseases, like how did everybody in the same family catch the disease. Now, today we know that things are contagious, that we can pass on that disease by our saliva or blood or mucus and things like that. But back then they didn't know that. They thought things spontaneously developed. Well, he was coming up with the idea, but he had not completely developed the idea of how they reproduced or how they were spread. But his buddy, Robert Remak, he was also studying this, and he had written in his notebook that he had the idea that all cells reproduce identical cells. Well, as Virchow was visiting his office one day, he saw that notebook open, and he had an aha moment. Yeah, that's how these diseases are spreading, is they're reproducing these identical cells. And so he took that and published that idea, and he actually was given credit for saying that all cells come from pre-existing cells. But it wasn't completely his idea. And about 50 years later, Robert Remak actually got some credit for it. But because he published first, he was the one that got credit for saying that all cells come from pre-existing cells. The next part that we need to look at are the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So after Robert Hooke had identified that things were made of cells, they started getting better and better microscopes, and eventually we found out that there were some single cell organisms that had no nucleus. And so when we divide everything on Earth by prokaryotic and eukaryotic, just simply because it either has no nucleus or it has a nucleus in its cells. So the no nucleus would be things like bacteria and viruses and things like that. Now they have the genetic code to be able to reproduce. They have ribosomes so that they can make protein. They have cytoplasm, and they absolutely have a cell membrane that keeps them all contained. But they don't have a nucleus. They're very, very tiny. We couldn't see these with the original microscopes. That we had to have much bigger scanning electron microscopes before we ever saw the first viruses. So eukaryotic cells, these are the ones that do have a nucleus, and they're usually larger cells. They're the typical cells that we think of: plant, animal, fungi. So they're going to have everything that the prokaryotic has, but it also has a nucleus, and they have membrane-bound organelles inside them. In your virtual notebook and in your paper notebook, you have a plant cell and an animal cell, and you need to be able to identify visually the basic parts of the cell. The nucleus, the nucleolus, because it's inside the nucleus. The mitochondria always looks like a little sausage thing that has a little zigzags back and forth. The Golgi body or Golgi apparatus is never up against the nucleus. It's always away from the nucleus. It's a packaging center, so it's packaging up the proteins to be able to push them out of the wall of the out of the membrane through the pores here. So it's out here by the membrane. Around the nucleus, we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is making lipids, which are fats, and it's also taking out the toxins, any poisons, any medicines. Like if you take Tylenol every day, it's going to be pulling out all of that out of our bodies that it doesn't think we need. It's not a nutrient, so it eventually gets rid of it. So the main parts of our body that has lots of Golgi bodies is our liver, because that's what filters most of our toxins out of our body. The rough endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes on it, and it's kind of like a highway that lets the ribosomes make proteins, and it kind of ships them along. It's where the proteins are being manufactured. Then they go over to the Golgi body and are packaged up and shipped out of the cell. Animal cells have centrioles. They also have these things called lysosomes that most of the plant cells don't have. Centrioles are used for reproduction, and they throw out spindle fibers. They separate the chromosomes apart. We'll talk about that more in depth when we start talking about heredity. Okay, next, so in the plant cell, you have to know that the difference in a plant cell and an animal cell is that it has a cell wall, and it has a very large water vacuole in it. I think of it like a swimming pool. If you see a cell that has a big, huge water vacuole, that it looks like a swimming pool, it's because the plant cell holds that water in the middle of it to keep the cells expanded. Otherwise, the plant wilts. The other thing it has are these little organelles here called chloroplasts, and that's where they take the sun's energy and water and carbon dioxide, and they produce glucose and the waste product of oxygen. In your notebook and in your online notebook, you probably had this picture. This is a great picture to be able to refer to. And you have the chloroplasts in the cell wall are unique to the plants only. And they also have this big water vacuole right here. So plants have chloroplast, cell wall, and a water vacuole that the animal cells do not have. while animal cells have centrioles and they do have lysosomes. If you did the assignment on photosynthesis and cellular respiration, you should have ended up with a picture that looks something like this on probably about page 11 in your notebook. And the basic concept was that in photosynthesis, plants take water and carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight and produce glucose, which is the simplest sugar that we know. And it gives off the waste product of oxygen. Plants can do this because they're called autotrophs and they have a chloroplast. In turn, sometimes the plants, they use their own glucose because at nighttime they don't make glucose. They actually have to use their glucose. Or whenever they are underground, before they get to the sunlight, they have to use the glucose that's stored in the seedlings or in the bulbs that are underground. So when people or animals eat any kind of plant matter, they're getting the glucose out of that plant. We also get vitamins and things too, but we mainly are getting the energy that was stored in this plant. So what happens in our body or any organism that consumes that glucose, the glucose is taken into the body and we breathe in oxygen, love oxygen, and our mitochondria actually take this and break it down by burning this glucose into ATP and carbon dioxide and water. Well, if you look at that in this form of cellular respiration, basically our cells are using the oxygen to burn the glucose. We're producing exactly what the plants need, and they are making exactly what we need. So it's kind of a cycle here that is taking place. The mitochondria do cellular respiration, the chloroplast do the photosynthesis. In another one of our lessons, we talked about the levels of organization. You actually watched a video by the Amoeba Sisters. I really like the Amoeba Sisters, if you haven't figured out, because they are Texas teachers and they know exactly what we have to teach in 7th grade. And so they make a lot of very important videos, but they're kind of simple and fun and very interesting. So I probably will use a lot of them this year because they're way more interesting than my videos are. And so when you watched the video, you saw that the smallest living thing was cells. And then groups of cells. Now this is not just one cell makes up a tissue, but groups of different kinds of cells then make up tissue. Then if we have different types of tissue that are working together, that makes up an organ. The organs work together. For example, maybe we have our blood veins, those are organs. Our blood is a tissue. We have those working together with our lungs and our heart, and we make up organ systems. Then those organ systems, when we put those together, an organism, a whole organism is formed. Many organisms put together make up a population, and then the populations of animals and trees and plants, when you put those together, that makes the community. Now, if you take the living and the non-living part, the biotic and the abiotic part, put those together, that comes up with the ecosystem. So each level makes up the level above it, but it takes groups of those to make it up. When you go over to the picture I had that was in the lesson that day, you saw that. So, for example, here's an epithelial cell, and it makes up epithelial tissue, which then those tissues working together make up the skin, which is an organ, and then that makes up our integumentary system. Going down to the nerves, so if we have a nerve and it makes up nerve tissue, the nerve tissue then can form our brain, and our brains and our spine make up our nervous system. Here's one that's really interesting. The blood cells. So we may have red blood cells, but if we take red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and we put all of those different blood cells together, we come up with blood being a tissue. So that's really one that gets a lot of people whenever they're asked that question, what is blood? Most people think that it's a cell. but blood is actually a tissue because it's different kinds of cells working together to make it. Then whenever you have the blood and you have all of the veins and everything in the heart, then you have organs. And then you have those things put together, they make up an organ system. So you've made it through 15 minutes of your life of a review for getting to retake the test. So if you'll look down in the bottom at the information, I will leave you the link to go to the test. If you don't get it, then you need to message me in Schoology, send me a little message, and I will send you the link. But you need to finish watching this video to get that.